The last of the day's light burned gold along the ridge, spilling down the slope like a slow-moving fire. Elias Brent stood on the porch, boots planted wide, the chill of the boards seeping through the soles. Somewhere beyond the tree line, smoke from a far-off fire mixed with the scent of dry pine and frozen earth. That was when he saw her. A lone rider swaying in the saddle emerged through the haze. Her horse's hooves struck the frozen ground with a tired, uneven rhythm. Between the pockets of drifting smoke and the flare of sunset, her figure looked almost unearthly, coat flaring with each step of the animal, hair loose under the shadow of a battered hat. As she drew nearer, the light caught on the sleeve of her coat. Dark stains, mud, maybe blood, blotted the fabric near her wrist. But her posture, that didn't match a woman in trouble. She rode with a straight back, eyes steady, as though she was the one deciding whether to approach him, not the other way around. Elias's dog Ranger broke into a low, deep growl. Not at her, but toward the slope above, where another horseman flashed into view for the briefest moment. A shadow on horseback, then gone again, behind the ridge. Elias's fingers itched toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Instinct said, "Trouble's coming." Another instinct, quieter, heavier, said, "She's alone and out in the cold." The wind knifed down from the peaks, slipping under his collar, carrying with it the damp lanolin tang of his wool coat. The moon's thin edge was just rising over the snowcaps when the rider slowed, stopping at the edge of the yard. She swung a leg over boots, crunching on frozen dirt. For a moment, she just stood there, reins in one hand, the other braced on the saddle horn, watching him with eyes that measured more than they revealed. "You've got a fire going," she said. Her voice was low, calm. "Could I water my horse and maybe warm up a bit?" Elias studied her. The stains on her sleeve were darker now that the light was fading. The animal beneath her was gaunt-hipped sides, damp from the long climb. His better nature tugged at him, but his father's voice, gruff, unyielding, rose in memory. "Help if you can, but don't invite trouble under your roof. You can use the pump by the barn," he said at last. "And there's an empty stall to bed your horse down." She gave a small nod, as if she'd expected no more. "That'll do." He stepped down, keeping the rail between them as he took her horse's bridle. Her fingers brushed the animal's neck, long, capable hands raw across the knuckles. She followed him toward the barn, her boots crunching in step with his eyes flicking toward the slope where Ranger had growled earlier. "You expecting company?" she asked without looking at him. "No," Elias said. "And I like to keep it that way." Inside the barn, he showed her the stall. She stripped the saddle with practiced ease, her coat shifting to reveal the worn burgundy of a prairie dress beneath. Torn at the hem, dust ground into the fabric. "You can stay in the hayloft tonight," he said. "Keeps warmer than the open. No room in the house, not for someone I don't know." She met his eyes for the first time, then a long, level look that carried no pleading, no offense. Just assessment, as if she were weighing whether he was a man worth trusting. "That's fair," she said finally. When he left her to settle in, Elias returned to the cabin, the door creaking shut behind him. He poured himself coffee, gone lukewarm, sat by the fire, and let the warmth climb into his stiff shoulders. His rifle rested across his knees. Without thinking, he tapped the stock with his fingers in a slow, thoughtful rhythm, a habit when his mind was working through a problem. He replayed the moment on the porch, the stains on her sleeve, the missing urgency in her eyes, and that other rider, a flicker of motion against the ridge. Trouble seldom traveled alone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. He leaned back, eyes on the flames, telling himself he'd made the right call. Then he heard it, faint at first, just enough to blend with the wind. But it grew clearer, a steady clop of hooves on frozen ground. Ranger stirred from his place by the hearth, ears pricking forward, low growl curling from his throat. The hoofbeats slowed and stopped. too close, right at the fence line. Elias set down his cup and reached for the rifle. If you've enjoyed riding into the first chapter of Wild West drama, don't just let the trail end here. Saddle up and subscribe. There's a long road ahead, and every twist, turn, and shadow on the ridge is one you won't want to miss. Out here, the next chapter could change everything. The morning came pale and gold, spilling over the ridge and through the mist that clung low to the ground. Elias stepped out onto the porch, breath ghosting in the crisp air, and scanned the yard out of habit. The frost was still on the grass, the world holding its breath before the work of the day began. That's when he saw them, fresh tracks, deep and sharp-edged in the frozen earth, running close along the back of the barn toward the corral. Not the narrow prints of a stray calf. Too long, too heavy. Ranger padded out beside him, nose to the ground, following the trail with a low, restless whine. Elias crouched, fingers brushing the outline of the print, the damp soil colder than stone. Whoever had been here had passed through after midnight, long after the hoofbeats he'd heard. By the pump near the barn, Clara was already at work. The sleeves of her coat were rolled back, revealing the pale curve of her wrists as she filled a bucket for the bay gelding she'd ridden in on. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her eyes were fixed far beyond the yard, on the mountains, hazy in the morning light. "Water's colder than it looks," Elias said as he approached. She glanced at him, then back to the mountains. "Cold doesn't bother me much." Before he could answer, the barn door slammed open, and Mara Lee came out, clutching a shovel nearly as big as she was. The girl's braid swung like a whip as she crossed the yard, eyes flicking to Clara with open suspicion. She set to clearing the frozen manure from the paddock, movements sharp, almost showy in their speed. Elias had just started toward the fence when it happened. The shovel slipped from Mara Lee's grip, its iron edge dropping with a dull thunk, a breath from Clara's boots. Clara looked down at it, then at Mara Lee. She didn't say a word, just bent, picked up the shovel, and held it out. The faintest curve of a smile touched her lips, the kind that wasn't about amusement, but about deciding something quietly for herself. Mara Lee took the handle without thanks and turned away. Elias lingered there, watching. He'd seen plenty of folks rise to a slight, more than a few make trouble over it. But Clara, she'd stepped aside unruffled. It didn't quite match the image painted by a wanted poster. "Fence lines got a few boards warped from the snow," Elias said finally. She nodded. "Point me to a hammer." They worked along the eastern fence, the air filled with the thwack of hammerheads and the crisp scent of split pine. Frost steamed where the sun found the wood, the smell clean and sharp. Elias drove the nails, Clara held the board steady. There wasn't much talk, but there was a rhythm, a passing of tools, the brief touch of gloved fingers, the sound of breath syncing with the work. Every so often he'd catch her eyes flick toward the tree line, quick and assessing before she dropped them again to the task. He wondered what she was looking for, or who. By midday, the frost had melted into slick mud under their boots. Elias wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and stepped back to check their work. That was when he noticed something on the porch. A knife. Not just any knife, a bone-handled piece with a crude C burned into the grip. Caleb Voss liked to leave his mark where it didn't belong. Elias's jaw tightened. He picked it up, turned it in his palm, then slid it into his coat pocket without a word. Later, when the shadows grew longer, he found Clara in the barn again. She stood in the stall, with her horse hand moving slow and steady along the animal's neck, murmuring something under her breath. The tone was low, almost tender, the kind of voice a person used when they'd run out of people to talk to. He leaned against the frame, listening, but catching no words. The gelding's ears flicked toward him, but Clara didn't turn. "Didn't hear you come in," she said softly. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't." She went back to brushing the horse, eyes fixed on its coat. as though it might give her an answer she hadn't found anywhere else. Elias thought about asking what she'd been saying. Instead, he left her to it. That evening, with the light bleeding out of the sky, Elias crossed the yard to shut the barn doors. The last glow caught on the trees at the edge of the property, and that's when he saw it. A rider. A dark figure on horseback, still as stone just beyond the tree line. Even at this distance, Elias could feel the weight of their gaze fixed on the yard, on the barn, on the people within it. The figure held for a long moment, then without a word or signal, turned the horse and melted into the shadows between the pines. Elias stayed where he was, one hand on the barn door, listening to the fading sound of hoofbeats in the dark. The wind was sharp that afternoon, pulling dry leaves across the yard like scraps of old paper. Elias was mending the latch on the chicken coop when the sound of hooves approached from the west. Not the hesitant rhythm of a stranger's mount, but the steady, deliberate gait of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Marshal Redden rode up the slope in a cloud of frost and dust, his coat, the color of worn bark brim of his hat, pulled low against the light. Elias straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. The marshal wasn't the type to pay neighborly visits. Without dismounting, Redden reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded sheet. He let it snap open in the wind. The paper was fresh from the press, still smelling faintly of ink and coal smoke. A wanted notice. Elias's eyes went to the drawing first, a woman's face, sharp cheekbones, hair loose over her shoulders. The set of the mouth was right, but the eyes, something in them was off. The gaze in the drawing was colder, harder, like it belonged to someone who'd long since stopped looking back. "Name's Clara Wynne Reddens," said voice cutting clean through the wind. "Accused of theft, unlawful flight, and suspicion of aiding in the Voss gang's escape from custody." The paper fluttered between them, the marshal's glove holding it steady, while the wind tried to tear it loose. "Seen her?" Elias took his time answering. "What's the reward?" $100. "That much for theft." Redden's jaw tightened. "That much for the company she keeps." Elias's gaze dropped to the sketch again, then to the mountains in the distance where the tree line broke like a dike's wave. "Don't look like the eyes I've seen," he said finally. "Eyes can lie," Redden said. "Face don't." From the barn, the sound of water sloshing in a bucket carried faintly. Clara was there, he knew, tending her horse the way she always did. Slow, careful. Like time moved different for her. Redden shifted in the saddle. "I'll be around for a few days. She turns up, you send word." With that, he wheeled the horse and headed back down the slope, the wind swallowing the sound of his departure. Inside the barn, Clara was pouring water into the trough, her movements measured, unhurried. Elias stepped in, the wanted notice folded in his hand. He didn't speak right away, just watched her for a moment, the way she brushed the frost from the rim of the bucket with her sleeve. When he finally held the paper out to her, she didn't take it. Her eyes flicked to it, then to the mountains beyond the open barn door. "That you?" Elias asked. She wiped her hands on her coat. "Depends who's asking." "I am." For a moment, the only sound was the horse chewing hay. Then she said, "Some folks see what they want to see, even in a drawing." Elias studied her profile, the light falling across her face in soft planes. He wanted to believe her. But memory had its claws, memories of a drifter he'd once helped, only to find half his tack room stripped clean the next morning. Trust was a door that swung open slowly for him, and once closed, it stayed shut. From outside, a soft creak of wood. He glanced toward the doorway and caught sight of Mara Lee, half hidden, pretending to sweep the porch. But her hands were twisted in the hem of her apron, knuckles white. She was listening. Elias let the paper hang between them. "I'm not telling you to leave," he said. "But if you're lying to me, I'll know." Clara turned, then really looking at him, for the first time since he walked in. There was no anger in her expression, no fear, just a steady patience that felt older than she was. "How long you lived out here?" she asked. 10 years, give or take. "And in all that time, you never learned to trust your own gut." Her words landed heavier than he expected. He slid the paper into his coat pocket and stepped back, giving her space. That night, the wind shifted from the north, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke. Elias sat at the small table in his cabin oil lamp, casting a circle of gold on the floorboards. Ranger was asleep by the hearth paws, twitching in some half-formed dream. The smell grew stronger. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked out. Past the edge of the corral beyond the first line of pines, a faint glow pulsed against the dark. Not the sharp flicker of a lantern on the move, but the low, steady burn of a campfire. Closer than last night. Close enough for the smoke to curl under the cabin eaves and into his room. Mara Lee's scream split the morning like a torn seam. Fire on the ridge. Elias was already at the door when the window flared red. He stepped onto the porch, and the world had shifted hues, pine and rock and ski washed in a violent, breathing crimson. The ridge above the east pasture burned like a row of lanterns knocked into dry brush. Wind dragged the flames sideways. Sparks leapt and skittered through the air, seeding new mouths of fire along the slope. For one thin breath, he didn't move. Years of sweat grass coaxed from stubborn soil fence lines, tamped into hard groundwater, hauled when the creek ran low, rose in him at once, as if all of it had stood up to be counted, and now was about to be carried off in the same red gust. Then he was running. "Drive them down!" he shouted, voice already rough with smoke. He grabbed the coiled rope and a wet bandana from the peg by the door. Ranger barreled past him, barking wild, as if he could herd the fire itself. By the corral, Clara was already there, sleeves shoved to her elbows, eyes bright and fixed. "What do you need?" she asked, as if it were a simple question, as if the mountain wasn't shedding sparks like a storm of bees. "Cut the north gate. Push the cattle toward the flats. Keep them tight. Don't let the wind scatter 'em." She nodded once, no fear in it, only commitment, then sprinted for the gate. Elias vaulted the rail boot soles, biting the frost-slick wood, and dropped among the milling cattle. Their bodies were furnace-hot against the cold. He could feel heat through the denim. He swung his rope and hollered, driving the first wave toward the lower pasture, where the creek bed opened into safer ground. The wind turned. Flame licked the top of a jack pine and took it whole, turning needles to embers that rained down like angry stars. The air whistled in his ears. Somewhere behind him, Mara Lee shouted again, smaller this time, swallowed by the roar that swelled as the fire found more to feed on. Elias cut a glance uphill. Fire was running the fence line, a quicksilver animal darting from post to post. If it crossed the far corner, it would run straight for the old shed, dry as tinder. He whistled to Ranger and pointed. The dog veered to nip a heifer back into the stream of bodies and then sprinted along the fence to harry a few stragglers. Gate, Clara's voice. Elias turned. She'd shouldered the bar up and dragged the gate wide, forcing her weight against a hinge that complained like a struck fiddle. Smoke pushed past her in blue ribbons. In the strange light, her face looked carved, every intent plain revealed. She slapped a palm against a steer's shoulder, sent it surging forward, then another, and another, building momentum until the whole corral moved like a slow river. "Go!" she yelled at Mara Lee, who had been swinging a rag, eyes streaming. "Down to the flats, keep left of the cottonwoods." Mara Lee coughed, nodded, and ran, but a gust took a cloud of sparks and flung it low across the yard. The girl hesitated, arm up over her face, and in that second, the old paddock gate warped by winter buckled. A crossbar split. The top rail twisted and fell. Mara Lee stumbled, and the world jerked sideways in Elias's vision. As he saw what would happen next, the rails, the collapse, the drag of timber and weir. "Move," he shouted. He started for her, but the cattle surged between them, bodies stacked shoulder to shoulder. A black steer sidestepped, snorting. A horn slid past his thigh, with a whisper that felt like a warning from the forge. "Alice, I've got her." Clara's voice again, closer, fierce, and certain. He saw her cut through the smoke, a dark slash in the red air rag, tied over her mouth. She was smaller than the chaos around her, but purposeful, like a blade that knew exactly where it would go. She reached Mara Lee as the top rail gave way. The rail dropped with a heavy cracking sigh. Dust leapt, ash whirled. Clara caught the girl by the back of her coat and yanked hard, pivoting, so the rail glanced off her shoulder instead of the girl's. The sound of impact boomed in Elias's chest. He felt it more than heard it. Then the smoke rolled in thick. The flames spoke in a language beyond sense, just hunger and motion, and all sound became one note, the rush of it, like a river in flood. He lost sight of them. For a few heartbeats long, ones the kind that stitched time into a different shape, Elias was forced to choose. He could turn and drive the cattle off the property line and save what livelihood would be left after the flames passed, or he could charge into the white-black column where the paddock had been and look for two figures in a world of shadows. He split himself one hand, and his voice and the turn of his shoulders kept the herd moving. The other part of him leaned toward the smoke, every muscle ready to go when there was the smallest opening. He caught himself talking without meaning, to half prayer, half order. "Stay with me, Ranger. Keep 'em tight. Clara, come on, come on." Heat washed over his face and along his forearms, a prickling that stung even through the denim. Ash landed on his cheeks and mouth. He tasted resin and salt, and something metallic at the back of his throat. He drove the last stubborn pair through the open gate with the rope and a shout, then turned, hard lungs burning. No sign. The smoke held its breath with him. He plunged in. The world inside the smoke was small and frantic. Pieces of it arrived and vanished, the absolute black at the heart of a charred post, the orange seam along a burning plank, the shock-white shape of a fallen bucket, the wheeze of something alive struggling. He followed the sound hand to the bandana at his face and nearly tripped over the rail that had fallen. "Clara," he called, but the word died inches from his lips. Then he saw them, two low shapes moving together, one dragging the other. Clara bent at the waist arm, hooked under Mara Lee's, hauling her along step by brutal step. The girl's braid was gray with ash. Her eyes were squeezed shut. Clara's shoulders lifted and fell in quick, determined bursts. She didn't waste herself on talk. She saved everything for pulling. Elias reached them, took Mara Lee's other side, and together they stumbled out into thinner air. The wind, suddenly a friend again, tugged the smoke free. Real color returned, the scorched brown of dirt, the raw yellow of a snapped post, the dull red of Elias's sleeve where cinders had kissed it. They set Mara Lee on the ground beyond the yard, where the slope fell toward the creek. The girl coughed, chest hitching, then coughed again, until sound opened in her lungs and she dragged in a breath, like a fresh start. Clara dropped to her knees beside Defer, pulling the bandana down and gasping a sound Elias felt between his ribs. "You two all right?" he said, voice wrecked. Mara Lee nodded, eyes brimming, and then unexpectedly laughed once. It came out like something breaking loose. At the same time, Clara's mouth twitched, and she let out a breath that might have been a laugh if she'd had air for it. The two sounds met in the space between them and made something that didn't belong to fire at all. The smell shifted as the wind veered again, smoke thinning, a colder current moving down off the snowfields. Under the char and resin, there was another scent: singed hair, faint and sweet threading, with the hot leather smell of the saddles nearby. Elias realized it was Clara's hair that had caught a spark. A few curled ends were blackened at her temple. She lifted a hand as if embarrassed and smoothed them back. "Thank you," Mara Lee managed, whisper thin. "I later," Clara said, still breathless, not unkind. "Get your feet under you." Elias helped the girl up, The cattle gathered in nervous knots on the flats, steam rising from their hides. Ranger trotted the edge of the herd tail, high, proud, and exhausted. "Creek will hold the line." Elias said more to himself than the others. The main tongue of fire, having overeaten, was already faltering, where the grass ran out and the black earth began. On the ridge, trees glowed from within and like coals, but the crown fire's sprint had slowed to a shuffle. They'd have a mess, but not a ruin. He turned to survey the upper slope, calculating losses out of reflex. How many posts? How many rails? Where to cut a trench tomorrow? That was when a different detail cut through the tallying voice in his head. Tracks. Not the churn of cattle, not the gouges of panic. 2 clean lines where a wagon or a buckboard had stood recent enough that ash still lay in soft drifts along the ruts. He followed them a few steps, squinting through the wavering heat. The twin lines led away from the point, where the first flare had jumped the ridge down a deer path most folks didn't know, skirting the north fence, angling toward the far property. Caleb's property. Elias's jaw worked. He crouched, touched the edge of the rut. The earth was warm, not from the fire, but from the friction of something heavy moving just before the flames had come. Wind pushed a burnt pine basuan across the track, as if to erase it. Elias, Clara's voice. He looked back. She had an arm around Mara Lee, steadying the girl. Smoke had painted their faces with gray. Clara's eyes were clear, waiting. He pointed with 2 fingers along the line the ruts had taken. "Somebody set a wheel up here," he said. "Not long before it started. Headed north boundary, then east." Clara followed his gesture. She didn't say Caleb's name. Neither did he. But in the blown-out light, the path the tracks had made might as well have been a signpost hammered into the blackened ground, pointing straight for the Voss spread. And as the wind freshened and the flames sank low into their own ash, Elias felt something colder than smoke move through him, a certainty clicking into place like a latch. The fire had not come alone, and it hadn't come by accident. Snow clung in thin white ribbons to the blackened fence posts on the eastern edge. Elias spotted something pinned to the charred wood, a half-burned scrap of paper, curling at the edges from flame. The ink was sharp and deliberate. Sell the land or lose more. The cold air seemed to draw tighter around him. When he lifted his gaze, Clara stood at the gate, scarf loose around her neck, a wisp of hair lifting in the breeze. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Her eyes met his, steady, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world narrowed to just that exchange. No words, just the silent weight of knowing. He tore the note free, tucked it in his coat. Inside, he said, his voice, even though his hand flexed unconsciously on the paper. The fire cracked in the hearth, the faint scent of pine sap, softening the edges of the cold. Elias set the note on the table, letting the lamplight spill across the words like a brand. "I need to know who you are," he said at last, "before I put this place and myself between you and whoever sent that." Clara's chin lifted a fraction. She didn't flinch, but one hand smoothed the fabric of her skirt, as though steadying something inside herself. "I worked at the Pike House in Cheyenne. 2 winters. The owner owed more than he could pay. One morning the safe was busted, money gone, and my handkerchief embroidered with my initial was sitting right there. I know who planted it. No one wanted to hear the truth, so I left before they could shackle me." Her voice didn't waver, but Elias caught the way her fingers had tightened until the knuckles paled. From the doorway, Mara Lee lingered, eyes flicking between them. She stepped forward without speaking, set a steaming cup of tea in front of Clara. It was a small gesture, but in it was something close to respect. Elias leaned on the back of a chair, studying Clara's face, the guarded calm, the faint shadows under her eyes. He thought of her in the firelight, days ago, smoke in her hair leading Mara Lee out from the blaze. He thought of how easily he could have lost her, before knowing if he even wanted to. "I believe you," he said finally. "And we're not backing down." A hint of breath escaped her, almost a laugh, almost a sigh. "Then we'd better be ready." They went over what needed doing: patch the fence, dig the firebreak deeper, watch the ridge lines. Clara volunteered for the north trail, where the deer came down to drink. Elias shook his head. "Not alone." A corner of her mouth twitched. "You planning to shadow me every step, if that's what it takes?" She didn't push the argument. That more than anything told him she understood the stakes. Late afternoon brought a bitter wind off the creek. As Elias drove the cattle toward the shelter of the western pasture, a streak of red on the snow caught his eye. He crossed the drift boots sinking and found a calf, standing rigid, one leg gashed open, blood beating and falling in quiet drops. He crouched, murmuring low, to calm it, eyes tracing the trail of crimson back toward the fence. The wire had been cut with precision, then twisted back into place to hide it. Beyond the line, a single boot print pressed deep into the snow, leading east, toward Caleb Voss's land. Elias straightened, pulling his coat tight, the cold cutting deeper than the wind alone. Clara was walking toward him now, scarf drawn, close eyes, asking questions he didn't answer. Instead, he glanced once toward the east and said, "We've got our answer." The look they shared then carried no fear, only the hard truth that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The moon hung low, throwing a pale wash over the pasture. The snow had crusted in the evening freeze, crunching softly beneath each careful step. Elias and Clara moved along the fence line, like shadows breathed, ghosting into the air in pale bursts. Ranger padded ahead, ears alert, tail still. They had set the snare hours earlier, rawhide loop hidden under the snow, its lead tied to a weighted drag tucked among dead sage. Every post along the fence had been checked and rechecked. Tonight was for catching what had been cutting the wire. The air was so still, Elias could hear his own pulse in his ears. Then hoofbeats. Faint at first, just a vibration through the ground, then clearer, a measured trot, slowing to a cautious walk. He caught Clara's eye, lifted 2 fingers. "Wait." From the line of cottonwoods, a rider emerged. His horse, the color of tarnished silver, exhaled clouds into the cold. The man slid from the saddle, leading the animal to the fence with practiced ease. He crouched, gloved fingers testing the wire. A single sharp tug. The rawhide loop snapped up, cinching around his ankle. The hidden weight lurched forward, tightening the hold. The man cursed, yanking a knife free. Elias stepped forward, but Clara was quicker. She swung the rope to knock the knife aside, steel flashing in the moonlight. The blade missed her by inches, slicing through the fringe of her coat. She stumbled, boots slipping on the crusted snow, and hit the ground hard. Cold seeped up her spine, sharp as broken glass. The rider lunged to cut himself free, but Elias caught his wrist, locking both hands around it. They grappled, boots grinding into snow, breaths coming fast. The knife wavered between them, its edge nicking Elias's sleeve. "Clara," he barked. "I'm here." She was already up, rope in hand, moving with purpose. In 2 quick motions, she looped the man's free arm and pulled it tight to his back. The knife clattered to the snow. The rider bucked, but the snare bit deeper. Clara worked the rope with steady, sure hands, binding wrists to ankle until the man's struggles slowed. Lantern light swept over the snow, throwing shadows long across the fence. Marshal Redden rode in. At a steady pace, not hurrying, not dawdling. He dismounted, boots crunching, and brought the lantern low over the man's face. "Evening, Jeb Redden," said voice flat. "Wrong night to be out walking." Jeb Voss scowled, but said nothing. Elias told the marshal about the calf's injured leg, the blood trail, the cut wire. Redden's eyes narrowed when he spotted dark stains along the knife blade. Fresh blood that wasn't from a man. "Calf's blood?" Redden asked. Jeb stared past him. I was checking the fence. Snare caught me. That's all. Redden's voice dropped into something quieter, heavier. And you carry a knife to fix another man's fence. Elias added, blood trail runs to this break. Knife was in his hand when I came on him. Jeb's jaw clenched. He didn't deny it. I can take you in for this, Redden said, cinching the rope around Jeb's bindings. And maybe you'll decide to talk about Caleb once you've sat a while. He hauled the man to his feet with the easy authority of someone who'd done it too many times. At the stirrup, Jeb spat in the snow. Oh, Caleb won't stand for this. Then he can come say it to my face, Redden said, swinging into the saddle. The lantern's glow receded into the trees, a small gold eye swallowed by the dark. The pasture fell still again, save for the creak of leather and Ranger's low whine. Elias bent to pick up the knife, holding it by the spine. Its weight in his palm was heavier than steel should be, heavier with what it meant. He slid it into his coat pocket. Clara stood near the fence rope dangling from her hand, breath still clouding the air. Her cheeks were flushed from cold and from the fight. Elias noticed the tear in her coat's hem, where the knife had passed, and felt a knot of something, fear, relief, anger, tighten in his chest. You all right? He asked. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her mouth. Didn't have time to be scared. Elias almost smiled back. Almost. They walked toward the house, Ranger scouting ahead, nose low to the snow. Elias found himself listening for more hoofbeats, though he knew none would come tonight. On the porch, Clara paused at the top step. Lamplight from inside brushed her hair, turning loose strands into copper. She looked at him, really looked, with none of the guardedness he'd seen before. I've found the place I want to stop, she said softly. What about you? Elias stood with one hand on the rail, the other resting on the knife in his pocket, still warm from his coat. The moon hung above them, bright against the cold dark. He didn't answer, not yet. The question lingered between them, sharp as frost, promising that whatever came next would change everything. Elias didn't answer right away. The words seemed caught somewhere between the steady beat of his heart and the cold air in his lungs. They stood on the porch, the lamplight from the cabin flickering against the snow. The fire inside crackled faintly through the half-open door. He looked at Clara. The night wrapped around them in silver and shadow, and for a moment it felt as if the whole world had stepped back to give them space. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried, I've never been kissed. It wasn't the confession of a boy, nor the boast of a man. It was something stripped bare, worn smooth by years of silence. His eyes held hers steadily, the reflection of the lamplight deep in the brown. Clara's breath misted once, twice, before she reached up. With a small motion, she removed her hat, letting her hair tumble free. The wind teased a few strands across her cheek. She smiled, not wide, but real, the kind that begins in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. Let's start slow, she said. Her voice was soft, almost a part of the snow's hush, yet Elias felt it settle in him, like the first warm ember in a cold hearth. Neither of them moved closer at first. It was as if they both knew that whatever they built here would have to stand on something steady. Elias's hand lifted slightly, hesitated, then found hers. The touch was small, but the warmth that spread through his fingers was immediate, surprising. Clara's fingers tightened around his, not as a question, but as an answer. The sound of the night, distant creek water under ice, a low sigh from the barn folded around them. Somewhere inside the cabin, the fire popped, and the scent of pine resin drifted out into the cold. A single snowflake drifted down, spinning lazily, before coming to rest on the shoulder of Clara's coat. She glanced at it, then back to Elias, as if to mark the moment for herself. From inside, Mara Lee laughed at something unseen, her voice carrying a lightness that had been missing for weeks. Outside, one of the horses gave a soft, questioning whicker, shifting in its stall. Elias squeezed Clara's hand gently before letting go, but the space between them didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like choice. The snow began to fall in earnest, slow, deliberate flakes, each one catching the lamplight before melting into the earth. A new season was coming. You could feel it in the air, see it in the way the frost didn't seem so sharp anymore. But it wasn't the kind of change that blows in with a storm. It was quieter than that. Clara stepped back toward the door, and Elias followed. They didn't speak, but neither needed to. The unspoken truth between them was clear. Whatever the winter brought, they would not be facing it alone. Some stories stay with you like the scent of wood smoke on a winter coat. Maybe it's the quiet look between two strangers on a porch, or the way a single snowflake can feel like a promise. If this tale found its way into your heart, I reckon it's because you and I share the same love for the dust, the danger, and the hope that still burns out here on the frontier. Thank you for riding this far with me. There's more trail ahead, and I'd be mighty glad to have you along for the next sunset.